companies tend to struggle to really understand the impact of the initiatives they're executing, or it takes a really long time for them to understand the impact. So for initiatives that aren't producing the desired impact, businesses waste a lot of money during that period, right? While they're kind of waiting for it to become obvious whether it is or is not working. But just as importantly, for initiatives that are successful, there's lost opportunity by waiting too long to understand the success while you could have been doubling down on it. So we thought this topic of quickly figuring out if initiatives are working or not is a timely one. You've probably all heard the mantra, fail fast. It seems to be almost a badge of honor, especially amongst tech marketing leaders. They like to say they embrace the fail fast concept of experimentation. The problem is, like with so many other things in modern go-to-market, those leaders are a little sloppy with the concept. And in fact, they've sort of largely missed the point. If you do a little research into the origin of the concept, the actual phrase is something akin to fail fast and learn, or fail fast forward. The operative point being that by quickly learning why something is not working, we get that much closer to coming up with something that will work. It's really just another phrase for rapid iteration. In fact, it's somewhat ironic that the origin phrase isn't actually succeed fast rather than fail fast, because had that been the case, we may not have gotten to the sloppy situation we have today. But anyway, somewhere along the line, the and learn in fail fast and learn, or the forward in fail fast forward, has largely been dropped. And that's been an issue. So as a result, Dan, if you go to the next slide, despite spending tons of money on new go-to-market initiatives, many organizations are simply experiencing a dramatic increase in customer acquisition costs, also known as CAC. And this is demonstrated with this particular chart around go-to-market efficiency from David Spitz at BenchSights. There are all kinds of reasons for this, right? Some of them are macro, due to the fact that we no longer live in a zero interest rate policy world. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that modern go-to-market teams keep trying new things, but they aren't positioned to really understand what's working and what's not, and ideally the why behind it. In other words, instead of embracing fail fast and learn concepts, they're really unknowingly participating in a spend fast and don't learn phenomenon. And this is really driven by two reasons. First, they don't generally set up their new initiatives to isolate from other initiatives they're working on. So it's not very clear what the cause and effect is that explains what's working versus what's not. Secondly, many of these businesses, and we tend to focus on growth stage and mid-market B2B organizations, many of them in tech and SaaS, but not all of them. And most of them don't really have a mature enough data strategy and infrastructure to even measure the stuff properly, had they actually set up their initiatives well to begin with. So what we're going to do today in this webinar is encourage you to use the language of experiment and science in order to be more productive with your go-to-market spend. By thinking like a scientist running an experiment, your go-to-market leaders will learn to understand the causality of what is working and what is not. And that's going to help them to more rapidly converge on the most efficient and effective strategies for growing revenue. We'll show you an example of the negative impact of not operating this way, as well as an example of the positive impact of embracing this experimentation culture. And then we'll talk about the role that analytical folks can play in making this a reality. So for the rest of this webinar, I'm going to distinguish between these two approaches as the spray and pray culture versus the experimentation culture, and just trying to make sure we draw enough contrast between the two approaches to go to market. Because the differences in outcomes between these approaches is really, really vast. It's not that spray and pray organizations don't like to try new stuff with the hopes of improving outcomes. It's really just that there isn't enough discipline in the way they try things to actually move the ball forward. And I think, Dan, did you want to do a quick poll at this point?
Yeah, I just threw a poll up, and the question is, how would you describe your culture? Scott just walked through these two very distinctly different cultures, spray and pray and experimentation, and we'd just love to know what your perspective is on this. What are things like inside your organization today? So appreciate everyone who would take that poll. If you don't see it, I believe it's down in the bottom icon bar on this screen.
All right, I'll just give that a second.
Is that popping up on your side, Scott?
I don't see it. Like I'm clicking on the polls thing and then it's not popping up. Well, let's just
keep rolling.
All right. So if we go to the next slide, Dan. So about 5.5 years ago, we landed our first customer at Scale Matters. And at the time, we hadn't really settled on precisely what our offering was. But we knew that we were skilled at leveraging data to improve go-to-market outcomes. And at our prior business, we had committed ourselves to being really a great data-driven business. And in a matter of about 12 to 18 months, we managed to reduce our cost of acquisition by nearly 70% and cut our sales cycle almost in half. And we basically started Scale Matters to productize our approach at the previous company. So our first customer was fantastic in their commitment to change their growth trajectory, right? I mean, you just love when people are eager to change stuff, right? But this commitment to improvement translated into a culture that tended to kind of chase the latest shiny object. There wasn't a lot of deep thought in what they did. And this is an example of spray and pray culture, and the negative impact of that is what we'll go through. So for what it's worth, this company sold digital marketing services and software to SMB, specifically home service providers like roofers, pool service companies, HVAC businesses, and so on. At the time, their go-to-market data strategy was essentially non-existent. They used Salesforce's Pardot as their marketing automation platform and Salesforce as their CRM. The tools weren't configured well, so there were all sorts of data inconsistencies and contradictions between the two. As a result, the weekly management meetings often devolved into shouting matches, right, between the sales leader and the marketing leader, where the sales leader would put up numbers from the CRM that would indicate that the quantity of leads coming from marketing was paltry, right? And the marketing leader would show his data from the marketing automation platform saying, well, they were producing a bunch of leads and accusing sales of not sufficiently following up on them. I don't know if this sounds at all familiar to you, but I've seen this play over many times. So given their target buyer, the marketing leader decided, Facebook advertising seems like a legitimate channel to reach these roofing companies, pool service companies, et cetera. So they decided to try Facebook ad as a channel to source new customers. What was clear and quickly was that as they ramped their spend on Facebook ads, the number of leads from Facebook really did grow proportionately. So the CMO got excited. The CEO got excited. And, had they finally found that holy grail of a scalable top of funnel strategy? Or was this just the latest shiny new object? Well, they started to dramatically increase the spend on this channel, right, as they saw success in driving leads. And as the lead volume increased, they basically instructed their SDR team to follow up on those Facebook leads so that they could get initial discovery meetings set up for the sales team. All seems logical, right? So we had been hired to help make their go-to-market data a more useful tool for management. And at the time, most of our work was manual in nature. And given how much money they were starting to spend on Facebook, we decided to turn our attention to making sure we could kind of connect the leads to the revenue, connect the dots, if you will. So we reconfigured both Pardot and Salesforce to make sure that the lead and subsequently pipeline opportunities were accurately attributed to the proper channel. We reconfigured outreach and Salesforce so we could properly track SDR activity and attribute it to the right leads and opportunities. And what we found was eye-opening, if not game-changing. The headline of the story was basically that these leads were so poorly converting that the return on investment was terrible. In fact, the return on SDR prospecting was more than 4 times better than the return on Facebook ads. And yet they had pulled resources away from prospecting to focus on Facebook. So we first looked at the middle and the bottom of the funnel. And based on conversion rates and kind of reverse engineering conversion rates and capturing the activities that the sales and SDR teams were doing, we were able to calculate that it took about 0.6 of an AE staff month and 1.8 SDR staff months to yield a deal that was sourced from Facebook. When we combine those staff resources, plus the media spend, which accounted for more than 50% of the marketing program budget, we were able to calculate that it was costing this company roughly $22,000 to get a deal from Facebook, or $1.82 per dollar of ARR. We did a similar analysis of cold call prospecting by SDRs. That showed a total cost of $4.6K per deal, or 44 cents per dollar of ARR. So the return, as we said before, was more than 4 times better than it was more than 4 times better with traditional SDR prospecting compared to the Facebook advertising. Yet the company had pulled their SDR resources away from prospecting in order to service those Facebook leads. So not only were they wasting money by focusing on a less productive strategy, they were actually losing out on revenue growth. So kind of in the spirit of better late than never, once we were able to provide this analysis after the fact, the company dialed back on Facebook and they re-emphasized prospecting and began to rejuvenate growth. You can see from this before and after look that once they re-emphasized SDR prospecting, they more than doubled their bookings from that channel. And they had an even more impressive results for AE prospecting once the AEs stopped wasting so much time chasing those low quality Facebook leads. In this case, they more than 10x'd their bookings. So the point here, this is an example of, I mean, we eventually figured this out, but it hadn't been set up front to do this. So just imagine, like if we hadn't already been working with them and been able to show them the fact that this strategy they were banking on was actually leading them on a path to failure, right? We helped them figure it out, but only after about 4 to 5 months. But had they had an experimentation culture to begin with, they would have recognized this issue months earlier than they did, which would have saved them a lot of money and generated substantially more revenue for them. And so now let's look at what it means to have an experimentation culture. So I grabbed this quote out of a book by Matt May and Pablo Dominguez at Insight Partners. Their book's called What a Unicorn Knows. But the it is constant experimentation, the lifeblood of innovation, without which the sleep-stealing threat of stagnation and eventual irrelevance looms large. That sounds pretty daunting or depressing to me. Well, experimentation is about innovation. And while most people think of innovation as really a product thing, it's just as important when it comes to go to market. We're constantly under pressure to do better, right? We're constantly looking for different approaches, hoping to improve outcomes. Whether we do this haphazardly, what we've called spray and pray, or whether we do this in a disciplined manner, what we call the experimentation culture, will largely determine our success. So the most pronounced thing we've noticed in organizations with an experimentation culture is that it's in their DNA to understand how actions connect to outcomes, because they know that by understanding cause and effect, it puts them in a better position to be intentional about which levers they push to accelerate growth and which levers would have minimal impact. But they also have a focus on speed. They want to quickly stop any experiments that aren't proving out so they don't waste money or lose precious time. But just as importantly, they want to quickly identify things that are proving out, right? So that they can double down on those initiatives and reap the benefits. And the final thing is that they are intentional about experimentation. So, kind of how do these cultural attributes or DNA attributes translate into practical steps? Well, for each material initiative they want to try, they ask themselves either what problem are we trying to solve or what opportunity are we trying to take advantage of? This is the primary rationale behind the experiment, and they document this, right? Next, they document the hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis is what you believe will happen as a result of this initiative. So, for example, let's say you're trying to solve for a problem which is your CAC is too high, and you want to experiment with your sales capacity because you believe you can reduce the sales head count by 20% without actually decreasing new bookings. That would be your hypothesis. In experimentation cultures, defining the hypothesis is often a collaborative opportunity in which you can get alignment across the functions or across constituents. So, an important thing about a hypothesis is that it needs to be testable. In other words, you need to be able to measure whether the hypothesis proves out or not. And this is probably the most important part of kind of being disciplined about designing an experiment, is you ask yourselves, how exactly will we measure the impact of this initiative? This is where so many organizations fall short because they never identify in detail kind of a sufficient way to isolate the impact of one initiative versus another. And to do so kind of typically requires a handful of discrete measurement points. And so many organizations simply look at aggregate outcomes, which is sort of the amalgamation of many things going on simultaneously. And one thing we always look for are early indicator measurements that we can take so we can arrive at a conclusion faster than sort of waiting till it becomes obvious. So once you're comfortable that the hypothesis is in fact testable and you've identified how you're going to measure it, well, the next step is to define pass-fail criteria. And related to that, sort of a duration, right, for the experiment. It needs to be sufficiently long to give the initiative a chance, but short enough to be consistent with rapid iteration. And getting alignment around these is critical. Too often, companies abandon initiatives before they've really had a chance to prove out, simply because they had unrealistic expectations of how fast results might show up. On the other hand, without defined end dates, too often these initiatives remain in place, even though they really aren't producing desired results. And that just wastes money, right? And finally, then, to kind of maintain organizational alignment, it's important to identify who all the interested parties are so they can be made aware of the progress of the experiment. So let's take a look at another example. This time it's a customer of ours that was in fact developing an experimentation culture. This customer was created through the PE initiated combo of 4 previously separate companies, all operating in the nonprofit tech space. And upon bolting these companies together, the lead PE investor suggested that on the whole, they were likely underinvesting in paid search and that they should consider dramatically bumping their paid search spend. So the CMO gathered the appropriate folks together, including representatives from the investment firm. And the goal was to get alignment around the details of the initiative to boost ad spend and codify an experiment in support of that. So now we're just popping into a piece of the Scale Matters software, which we're using this because it's an easy way to demonstrate the points we want to make, not that it's critical that you use Scale Matters software. In this particular case, the customer used our platform, Full Funnel Analytics platform. So they started, and again, the important thing here is that you codify your experiments. So they started by naming the experiment and then documenting the rationale, which is the business problem to solve. or more accurately, in this case, it was really an opportunity to be exploited. They agreed on a hypothesis, which was the belief that if they quadrupled ad spend, that they could at least double and possibly even triple new bookings from paid search, and that would still be an efficient investment, as evidenced by the line, still provide an attractive CAC. Note that the hypothesis assumes there'd be some efficiency loss because they're going to 4x spend while only increasing bookings 2 to 3x, but that level of efficiency was still deemed acceptable. So next, they spent a fair amount of time trying to think about how they would measure the impact of the initiative. Since we had done a good job for them making sure that their kind of channel level attribution was sound, they knew it'd be fairly straightforward to measure whether the bookings increased by 2x or more, but that would require waiting, a full sales cycle or 1.5 sales cycles before they had their answers. And they were naturally reluctant to do that given how much money they were spending each month. So instead, they wanted leading indicators. So they decided that the very first indicator would be measuring web sessions attributed to paid search, just to make sure that there was some relationship between that trend and their spending trend. And given the expected pattern on web sessions, they would then measure the conversion rates from web sessions to demo requests to, first meetings, and so on down through the funnel, right? And finally down through the win rate from pipeline opportunities to deals. And they concluded that if the conversion rates fall dramatically as ad spend goes up, then they would know that the hypothesis would not prove out. That was basically their their pass-fail criteria is if the combined conversion rates fall far enough that you can't get at least 2x increased bookings on 4x increased spend, then it's not going to work. They set a 6-month duration, which was about the length of 1.5 sales cycles, but they did agree that they could end earlier if failure was evident, but based on the measurements. That way they wouldn't kind of waste money unnecessarily. And they noted who all the interested parties were so that they could be continuously updated. And then again, with the Scale Matters software, they added the visualizations to track the things that they decided to measure, right? So they created this effectively experiment dashboard that all the interested parties could continuously track and understand how things were going. And again, this isn't a pitch for our software, but rather a good example of what it looks like to institutionalize an experimentation culture. And as long as you have your data set up properly, an ability to snapshot it so that you can provide trends, then you could use pretty much any BI tool to track these things in a similar fashion. So, and by the way, we can provide you with a free template. Dan, you can figure out how we're going to get that to people that is basically very helpful to help you codify your initiatives or experiments in this fashion. So let's look at the result, though. So they started the initiative on February 23rd, this is a couple of years ago, and they captured that using the event log. And as soon as they increased the daily ads budget, they saw a concomitant increase in web sessions from search ads. So at the surface, this was positive, right? We're spending money on ads. We're seeing more people come to the website, and it seems correlated. But almost simultaneously, they experienced what amounted to a 22% decrease in the conversion rate from web sessions to demo requests. Now, if that was the only hit to conversion rates, that would have been fine because they still would have easily been at 2x or 3x increase in bookings. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Shortly after noticing the decline in web sessions converting to demo requests, they witnessed an even steeper decline in demo requests converting to pipeline opportunities. That went from 40 to 25%. Not long thereafter, they went to the next conversion rate, opportunities to deals. That had a precipitous drop from 19.5% to 6.5%. So they had their answer really in a matter of 6 to 8 weeks. The hypothesis hadn't proved out. In fact, as they spent more money, they actually closed less deals because the increased spend drove in massive quantities of low quality leads. And once the sales team recognized this, they sort of started ignoring the demo request leads from paid search and turned their attention elsewhere, which only made the situation worse. So hopefully, by walking you through this example, it's become clear why managing experiments with this level of discipline really is critical. And that's because of the speed and certainty with which you get answers. In this case, these folks knew in 6 to 8 weeks that their hypothesis didn't hold. And had they had to wait another 8 to 10 weeks for a full sales cycle to complete, they wouldn't have learned anything new, but they would have wasted almost another $500,000 in ad spend over the course of those 2 months. So with a disciplined experimentation culture, you will be quicker, both to stop the bad stuff and the associated wasted spend, but also to find the good stuff and the associated growth that's worth doubling down on. So if we could go, Dan, back to the presentation and the FP&A slide. I imagine as I was going through that example that many of you are saying to yourself, I'll never see my sales and marketing leaders operating in this kind of disciplined fashion. And, in many cases, you may be right, at least left to their own devices. But profitable growth is a team sport. And we think FP&A folks or go-to-market analysts are actually the best positioned to enable this type of experimentation culture. The concepts of instrument everything, right? To make sure you understand the causal connections between actions and outcomes. The concept of modeling, they are not foreign to you. You are directly involved in the budgeting process and can easily make line item approvals kind of conditioned on running effective experiments to prove out the hypotheses that are being proffered, right? But most of all, you can help the revenue leaders. You can be the one who has the patience to force people to codify their experiments, and then the ability to deal with the tedium of working with RevOps to make sure that proper instrumentation is in place in order to test the hypothesis. You've all heard kind of about the strategic finance movement. Well, helping to drive an effective experimentation culture in your organization is a necessary component of strategic finance. So that ends our webinar, our prepared remarks. Happy to open it up to any questions for those of you who are still hanging on.
Thanks, Scott. And I was finally able to pull up the results of the poll from earlier. We had 64% of respondents said that they were trying to get to an experimentation culture. 21% that said they had experimentation culture, and 14% said they had a spray and pray culture, which is actually great news because you came to the right place to learn how to get to an experimentation culture, since that was the overwhelming majority of folks. Thanks so much for coming to the webinar today. Here's Scott's contact information. In case you have any questions for him, you can reach out to him by email or connect with him on LinkedIn. I also just posted the link to his LinkedIn profile in the chat. We had one question that just came in from Ryan. Ryan asked, do you have any advice around not over-engineering experiments? He said that's always a challenge when preaching scientific method in our organization. Good question.
Yeah, good, very good question. And I would say, in my experience, it's not that people over-engineer, it's that they have a disconnect between what they say they want to measure to be able to, understand the impact of an initiative and what they actually can measure. And so the first thing I would say is make sure that you have the supporting data infrastructure to actually be able to test these hypotheses, right? Because otherwise it's just sort of fantasy that you have this wonderful experiment, but if you can't actually test the hypothesis, it's completely useless. So, that doesn't really answer the potential propensity to over-engineer, but it's often what I have found is people create these fantasy initiatives because they can't test them.
Okay. Scott mentioned a resource a template that we're going to share after the webinar is done. I'm going to send that out. I'll just share what it looks like. We're just calling it the go-to-market experimentation template. It has a open text field where you can fill in exactly what Scott walked through, from experiment name down to hypothesis, pass-fail criteria, etc. We include the example in here that Scott walked through, just in case you want to share that internally, and an example of some of the charts that were used to track this experiment that he walked through in the webinar. And then you can also download it in Docs or open it up in Word if that's easier for you. So I'll be sending that out. The other thing is we have this 10-question assessment. It's called the Go-to-Market Reporting Health Check on our website. It helps you grade how confident you are in your ability to answer the most critical go-to-market operational questions. So we invite you to head over to our website. I'll just pop this in the chat right now and take that assessment in case you want a little bit of feedback. And then there's an email you'll get with specific helpful resources and context around your score on the health check. So thanks so much for coming today. Again, our next webinar in this series is on the 20th, how to adjust go-to-market investments when things aren't going to plan. Thank you all for coming today and for your attention. And thanks, Melissa. I see your comment in the chat here. Appreciate you sharing, and hope to see you on a future webinar. And have a great morning, afternoon, wherever you are. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
See you all. Bye now.